Good morning. My name is Glenda Kenyon, and on behalf of the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago, I want to thank you for joining us for our Sunday program. Although myself, our esteemed speaker, and a small team are here in the building, our Sunday programs are currently virtual for our audience. We're happy to have you join from your home with, keeping safe and secure during this crazy pandemic time we find ourselves in. And we look forward to seeing you in the person someday soon. We typically do like to offer a quote at the beginning of the program to help illuminate what humanism is for those who may not have heard it before. Today, I would like to offer a quote from the American Humanist Association's website. Humanism is a non-theistic worldview with ethical values informed by scientific knowledge and driven by a desire to meet the needs of people in the here and now. At the foundation of those values is an affirmation of the dignity of every human being. Our programs address a wide variety of topics, including current events, philosophy, arts, and sciences, to name just a few. Today's presentation is part of our ongoing program relating to humanities. I'm happy to introduce Miles Harvey, who will speak on King of Confidence, the story of an 1840s charlatan. Miles Harvey is the author of the national and international bestseller, The Island of Lost Maps, and the recipient of a Knight Wallace Journalism Fellowship at the University of Michigan. His book, Painter in a Savage Land, was named a Chicago Tribune Best Book of the Year and a Booklist Editor's Choice. He teaches creative writing at DePaul University in Chicago, where he is a founding editor of Big Shoulders Books and director of the DePaul Publishing Institute. And without further ado, here is Miles Harvey.
Well, thanks, Glenda. And I want to just start by thanking Rick Guthman and you, Glenda, and Sherry and Sharon and the great technical team we have here who've been getting this together. I'm really honored to be here. And I want to talk to you today about this guy who you see on your screen, James Jesse Strang. He's, as you can see, he's not a particularly dynamic looking fellow, but in 1850, he led a group of Mormons to an island in the middle of Lake Michigan, Beaver Island, where he promptly declared himself king of earth and heaven. And I want to talk to you about him. And I wanted to start, actually, I'm going to grab something from my bag here. So, why would this short, slightly cross-eyed, balding man be such a big deal in the 19th century? Because he was really an internationally known figure. He caught headlines all over the world. And I thought I'd just start by a very short reading about what drew people to him, partly because I think it also tells us something about the times he lived in. Although James Jesse Strang was physically unimposing, a few inches over 5 feet and bald with an oddly bulging forehead, he did possess one distinguishing feature. His dark brown eyes, which one acquaintance described as rather small but very bright and piercing, giving an extremely animated expression to his whole countenance. Another claimed that those eyes seemed as though they could bore right through a person, but more than any tangible attribute, Strang possessed an invisible, ineffable aura called confidence. And in those days before electrical power, confidence was what made antebellum America hum. Confidence was black magic, good fortune, and hard cash combined. Confidence could turn worthless paper into glittering gold, cow towns into cities, empty lots into bustling businesses, losers into winners, paupers into millionaires. Confidence was a charm deployed by bankers and merchants, philosophers and politicians, clergymen and card sharps alike. Confidence was the soul of trade, in the words of a leading financial publication. Without it, added Herman Melville, commerce between man and man, as between country and country, would, like a watch, run down and stop. In an age before the federal government began printing paper money, an age when people had to trust in privately issued banknotes, glorified IOUs, confidence was the de facto national currency. And so that's what this guy had. He had this ability to exude confidence in a time when, like our own, truth was very porous. So I want to just tell you a little bit about Strang and how he sort of rose to power. So he grew up in a time and a place where there were just intense religious fevers. The time was 1830s and 40s, and the place was Western New York, an area called the Burned Over District. And there were a lot of scenes like you see up on your screen in the Burned Over District at that time. This was an era of great religious belief, intense, in mainstream churches, but also sort of outsiders. There were lots of prophets running around. This is where we get Mormonism. Joseph Smith was definitely from the Burned Over District. But it's also where we get so many exciting social movements from that period, this period before the Civil War, known as the antebellum period. So feminism doesn't necessarily, well, it sort of does come from Western New York, from the Burned Over District, but the anti-slave movement was going strong there. It's also where we get spiritualism, table knocking and whatnot. It's all from this one place. And Strang was part of that. His parents were really firm believing Baptists, and he came from a little town where there was just religious craziness going on. And he was secretly an atheist. So one of the cool things for me about writing about Strang was that we have some of his diaries still intact from his late teens and early 20s. And they reveal a man of intense contradiction. So he wrote a lot of his diary in a secret code. He was sort of obsessed with secret codes. And there was sort of the official version of Strang and the unofficial true version of Strang, or at least partly true version of Strang. And one of the things he wrote in those coded sections is that he confessed, I'm a complete atheist. I don't believe in any of this stuff going on around me. Any of these camp meetings like you see here. He mocked a camp meeting. But he also said, man, when I talk about religion, people listen. And so from the start with Strang, you have this contradiction, the idealist and the opportunist. And that continues for his whole career. So Strang was a failure for much of his life, for his early life. He attempted to be a lawyer and ended up ripping some people off, and he stopped getting clients. He was a postmaster, which was a really powerful position in the early United States, but he was kicked out. It was very much a patronage job when there was a switch in presidential administrations. And then he was a newspaperman, and he was actually quite a good writer, I think. I admire, I wouldn't want to read his novels, but as sort of a propagandist and a storyteller, he had certain skills, but he was not good at running that newspaper. Lost that job. Ended up getting kicked out of the Burned Over District. According to one newspaper report, he sold a plot of land in Ohio that didn't exist, in which case he had to fly by night, as they said at the time. He and his family left, and he supposedly faked his own death. And he wound up here in what was then known as the West. The term Midwest didn't come along for quite some time. And he wound up in the little town of Burlington, Wisconsin, which some of the members will no doubt know as a town that's like 2 hours northwest of Chicago. It's a beautiful little town on the corner of at the confluence of the Fox River and the White River. And there, Strang tried to make a new life. He again started practicing law, and some of his associates in this old town of Burlington were friends from Western New York who happened to be Mormons. The Mormon church was brand new then and a very exciting place for people. And at one point in 1843, I think, Strang visited this town, Nauvoo, Illinois, which was then the central location for the Mormon church, but also was just a incredibly bustling town. It was arguably bigger in population and stature than Chicago. It drew people from all over the world. The Mormons were wonderful at recruiting people, especially disaffected poor people. And so Strang visited this town, and he had a conversion to Mormonism. The million-dollar question for me, which I have no answer for you about, is whether he actually believed in the tenets of Mormonism. And I just don't know. One thing I'll say about Mormonism is at the time it was just a very exciting religion for a lot of people. It not only promised that the Bible was still unfolding in the 19th century, but that it was unfolding in the Americas. And I think that would have been just a heady thing. I think sometimes now we can look at it, obviously by comparison, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a very new church, but it feels old to a lot of Americans. But I think at the time it was a very, very cutting edge church. And in any case, shortly after Strang converted to this new faith, Joseph Smith, its founder, was murdered in Western Illinois near Nauvoo in June of 1844. And this caused a crisis in the church. Who was going to run it after the prophet? Well, James Jesse Strang claimed that the correct answer was him. Shortly after Smith's death, he produced this letter, and a copy of which, or the original of which, is still at Yale University. And this letter, it purports to be a letter from Smith to Strang saying, basically, I put you, young man, in charge of this faith with tens of thousands of followers. Modern experts think this is a forgery, and I think it probably is a forgery. But it was a really quite a good one. Strang had a knowledge of the postal system because of his job as a postmaster, and really understood a lot about how to make a letter look real. In any case, Strang he walked 200 miles to a Mormon meeting and presented this to some Mormon leaders, and they sort of laughed him out of there and said, yeah, that's not real, and go away. This would be like, for instance, I'm a citizen of Chicago, me claiming that Lori Lightfoot just had written me a letter saying I'm in charge of the city. It's kind of crazy. But Strang was able to convince people, and so he started picking up a small group of followers in this town of Burlington. When the letter didn't work, he produced some brass plates, and here's a drawing from the period of one of those brass plates. I'm wondering if any members of the congregation can read this. Well, actually, I'm not wondering because I know you can't. There was only one person on earth who could read these brass plates, which were dug up in a hill in Burlington, Wisconsin. They were from a secret language, and luckily, James Jesse Strang was able to translate them. And you will be shocked to know that these brass plates basically put him in charge of the church. Some of you who know a little bit about the history of the Mormon church will see that this is an echo of Joseph Smith's golden plates, which he discovered in New York, which eventually became the Book of Mormon. And so when Strang found these plates, supposedly in a hilltop in Burlington, Wisconsin, to many Mormons, it signaled that he was a prophet. I also just want to talk about the times that this was all taking place in. These are two people who aren't often put side by side, although they were total contemporaries. On your left there, well, let's start with the guy on the right. That's Karl Marx, of course. And so in 1848, Marx and Engels write the Communist Manifesto. And no matter what you think about that document, I think it's like rereading it. When I was working on this book, I was struck by how it talked about the strange times that people were living in. So this is a time when our fundamental notions of space and time are really askew, right? Like the photograph has just been invented, which freezes time and changes time in significant ways. The telegraph alters our notions of time and space, right? All of a sudden you can be in DC and be hearing from New York simultaneously. And then, of course, train transportation is really changing the United States, especially in the way people relate to space and time. It's a very disorienting time. It's a time full of massive economic disruptions. It's a time when human beings are suddenly, in the United States, are suddenly moving around a lot. And so it's a nation of strangers all of a sudden. You don't know who to trust. It's a nation where truth is very, very, very porous. And there were people who took advantage of that. And one of them is the guy on the left in your picture. That's P.T. Barnum, the great showman. And, you know, we think of Barnum today as a circus impresario, which he was later in his career. But he made his fame in antebellum America. He was one of the most famous people around. And he made his fame by these series of sort of hoaxes. I mean, it was, to a certain extent, it was sort of, here's one of his hoaxes. That's a mermaid that he called it the Fiji mermaid. He had a museum in New York, which was immensely popular. I don't know what to compare it to, but a big tourist attraction. And this was on display there, and people would come in to see it. And Barnum was just really extraordinary. So if you saw this mermaid, some people said, wow, a mermaid. And other people said, that's not a mermaid, that's a primate stitched to a fish. And Barnum's response was not like, no, you have to believe that it's a mermaid. He said, oh, you don't believe it? Well, some people say it is a mermaid. You know, why don't you bring your aunt in and all your cousins next week and pay fare and pay admission to my museum, and we'll see what they think about whether it's a mermaid. And we know this sort of multiple truth thinking in our own time, right? Where we just had a president who always said, some people believe, some people say, some people believe. That was Barnum. He was brilliant at it. And in a time when truth was not a solid thing, he became a famous man. This was a time when there were widespread reports, for instance, of sea serpents. In 1848, a lot of people thought that the world was coming to an end. There were widespread predictions that we were in the end times in 1848. And those beliefs were accompanied by appearances of serpents all over the United States and all over the oceans all over the world. And Strang, in fact, claimed to have seen a serpent on his colony that he went to after the colony in southern Wisconsin, off Beaver Island. And so he took advantage of those. I wanted to talk to you about why these things, which seem kind of crazy to us, had a lot of traction in the mid-century. People ask me, was Strang just a con man, or was there a particularly American quality to his deception? I don't really have an answer to it, but I'm interested in what this guy had to say about it. This is Charles Dickens, of course, who visited the United States around the time where Strang was sort of forming his own worldview. And Dickens was struck by a certain American attraction to figures like Strang. He visited Cairo, Illinois, and he saw this real estate scam there where all these Englishmen, but I think also Americans, had been promised this beautiful land, which turned out to be swampland. Dickens was struck by the way Americans treated the guy who perpetrated this absurdity. And I'm trying to, yes, here we are. So he wrote about it in this way. He started talking to the people in the area. I recollect on both occasions of our passing that ill-fated Cairo on the Mississippi, remarking on the bad effects of such gross deceits must have when they exploded in generating a want of confidence abroad and discouraging foreign investment. But I was given to understand that this that this was a very smart scheme by which a great deal of money had been made. And it was the smartest, and its smartest feature was that they forgot these things abroad in a very short time and speculated again as freely as ever. The following dialogue I have heard 100 times. Is it not a disgraceful circumstance that such a man as so-and-so should be acquiring a large property by the most infamous and odious means, and notwithstanding all the crimes of which he has been guilty, should be tolerated and abetted by your citizens? He is a public nuisance, is he not? Asked Dickens, to which came the reply, yes, sir. A convicted liar? Oh, yes, sir. He has been kicked and cuffed and caned? Oh, yes, sir. And he is utterly dishonorable, debased, and profligate? Yes, sir. In the name of wonder, then, what is his merit? Well, sir, came the response, he is a smart man. And so there was this whole notion that Dickens was sort of, taken aback by, which was the notion of the smart man in the United States. This guy who could con you, take your watch, and then you'd say, wow, that was really, really a brilliant scheme. He took my watch. That guy must know a lot. That maybe is an American thing. I'm not sure. I don't know. But I do know that eventually Strang surrounded himself with some of the great con men of the 19th century. This guy is a guy named John C. Bennett. These guys are bigger than life characters. A whole movie could be made about this guy. He was one of Strang's top lieutenants in southern Wisconsin in the colony he called Voree. He had been at Nauvoo before. The governor of Illinois called him the greatest scamp in the Western country. He had no formal degree in medicine or in anything else for that matter, but he became this nationally well-known kind of quack doctor. One of his claims to fame was that he promoted the health benefits of the tomato, and it turned out he was right about the health benefits of the tomato, but I don't think that was why he was doing it. He started in Indiana the first diploma, possibly the first diploma mill in the United States, where you could just go in and get a degree in law or medicine without doing anything. He eventually joined the Mormon Church and became the head, without any military training, of a huge force in the Mormon militia, a huge, well-organized force, became kind of a national figure. Eventually, he was kicked out of Nauvoo. He was a big proponent of what was called the spiritual wife doctrine, which was essentially polygamy or led to polygamy. Although Bennett is sometimes cited as the person who introduced that idea to Joseph Smith, he practiced it with a little bit too much vigor and a little bit too little subtlety, and eventually ran afoul with church officials and was kicked out of Nauvoo. Another guy who was in Nauvoo at that time was this guy, George Adams, who was one of the truly astounding con men of his period, and just a great character, so much fun to write about. He was a Shakespearean actor / Mormon preacher. The New York Times described him as a deceiver of the first class. He would go around the country doing Shakespeare readings on one night and proselytizing, first for the mainstream Mormon church in Nauvoo and later for Strang, Another Night. The Times called him as poor as an actor who has ever spoke. He was a notorious drunk, although he often went around preaching abstinence from liquor. He had supposedly such intense body odor that if another actor borrowed one of his costumes, it had to be destroyed. There's a great story about him which made headlines all over the world. In 1847, this picture appeared in a Boston newspaper, and it shows Adams as kind of a fop, right? A kind of a pretentious fake Shakespearean actor. And Adams was so angered by this picture that he tracked down the editor of the newspaper with a horsewhipped him on the streets of Boston, and then announced his name and told the huge crowd that had gathered around him where he would be playing that night. So he was another just intensely duplicitous but interesting character. Adams, as a footnote, went on to survive Strang's colony, and he later started his own colony in Jaffa, and it went very, very badly. A lot of people died. And while he was researching and writing Innocents Abroad, this guy, Mark Twain, had heard about the colony. And Twain was really interested and wrote about Adams at the time and about what a fraud he was. But at least one scholar, and I think he makes a really cogent argument, argues that Adams was the basis for the king in A Huckleberry Finn. And so we may know Adams through that book a little bit better than we think. Here's another great con man who was affiliated with Strang. This is Charles J. Douglas. He is secretary and nephew. And in 1849 and 1850, Strang and Douglas traveled the East Coast recruiting people into Strang's colony. And then they would go back and share a hotel room. The only trouble was that Charles J. Douglas wasn't Charles J. Douglas. He wasn't Strang's nephew. Charles J. Douglas was a young woman by the name of Elvira Field, who was Strang's first plural wife. Strang already had a wife, but he didn't want his wife to know about this second wife he'd taken on. And so they traveled the country for many months with Elvira in these clothes. Did they fool some people? Yes, they certainly did. Strang had an aura about him. People would believe the most insane absurdities from him. He also didn't fool a lot of people. People were writing. There's lots of letters still around of people saying, why is Strang traveling with a woman? Oh, I guess I know. So another interesting thing about Field was just like a really wonderful person to think about. Anyway, she was kind of a proto-feminist. She was a really interesting person to write about in this book, of many that I wrote about. Strang, until he met her, had been the anti-polygamy pretender to the or contender for the leadership of the Mormon Church, but she changed that, and he ended up dying with 5 wives, 4 of whom were pregnant at the time when he was killed in 1856. Okay, so in 1850, he moved to Beaver Island in the northernmost Lake Michigan, and set up a utopian colony there. And I want to talk about that colony, but I've talked about some of the deceptive parts of Strang, but I want to just get at why Strang might have had appeal, and I think for ethical humanists, there's a tie-in here. There was this period of history in the antebellum period was, among other things, an amazing period for utopian ideas, utopian colonies. When Strang was in southern Wisconsin, 100 miles away was a Fourierist, they called it, socialist utopian colony. There were dozens of those, I think 23 around the United States. Some leading thinkers of the time the great proto-feminist Margaret Fuller included were believers in this. Charles Dana, one who had belonged to one of those colonies, said, our ulterior aim is nothing less than heaven on earth, the conversion of this globe, now exhaling pestilential vapors and possessed by unnatural climates, into the abode of beauty and health. And so there was this strong questioning of traditional religions. There was this notion of, can we do this better? Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1840 joked, "We are a little wild here with numberless projects of social reform. Not a reading man, but has a draft of a new community in his waistcoat pocket." So that's Emerson joking about that. But in 1860, 20 years later, Emerson called for a new ethical church. There will be a new church founded on moral science. At first, cold and naked, a babe in the manger again. And he called this to be based on science. And I'm no expert on ethical humanism, but I think Emerson's thoughts on that were sort of proto-ethical humanists. So I'm not saying, I want to be clear, that Strang's colony, because it wasn't, was the same as ethical humanism. I think they came out of the same exciting period in history when all sorts of new ideas were around. In any case, in 1850, Strang declared himself king in a ceremony at a half-built log church on Beaver Island, which some of you have gone there, I'm sure. It's still a very distant place. It takes 2.5 hours to get there by ferry. It's a beautiful place, but you feel like you're still on the American wilderness. This is a illustration from Hans Christian Andersen's Emperor's New Clothes, which was just being read in the United States at that time. And I think it sort of illustrates the absurdity. Strang's throne was stuffed with moss, but people took him seriously. And one of the people who took him seriously was this man, Millard Fillmore, President of the United States. In 1851, Fillmore sent in this ship, which was the USS Michigan. It's the Navy's first iron-hulled warship, so really technologically advanced. He sent it in to raid Beaver Island and bring Strang to justice. And he went up there with Fillmore didn't go up there. A group of soldiers, militiamen, went up there, brought Strang back with a bunch of his followers. They were put on trial in Detroit, huge headlines. Strang was found innocent. And so Fillmore left office in 1853, I think, and went down in history as one of the least effective and most laughable U.S. presidents. While the president left, the king was still in power. So that's one of the interesting things about this. One of the things Strang did was set up a pirate colony on Beaver Island. And this is a headline from the New York Times about raids by Strang's church member on coastal cities, including Chicago, by the way, where they would plunder, make these lightning raids, plunder the cities, and then take the goods back up to Beaver Island. They also would send out groups of horse thieves all over the Midwest. I think one of the things the King of Confidence, my book, does is sort of pin down some of their crimes. There's an entire book written about Strang which claims that he was just the victim of anti-Mormon bias, right? Like that he didn't do it, that this was a plot against Mormons. It was all anti-Mormon prejudice. Other people were committing the crimes. The Mormons were getting blamed for them. And there was certainly a ton of anti-Mormon hatred. They were a persecuted people, but there were also real crimes. And my book does a lot to pin that down. I also want to just talk briefly about the fact that even the people committing these crimes, a lot of them had this utopian impulse. I mean, people on Beaver Island, honestly, many of them thought that they were bringing around the second coming of Christ on Beaver Island. And so there was always this strange mix, and I think we know it in our own times, of opportunism leading people to do things, and a strange kind of idealism leading people to do all sorts of crazy things, including on January 6th, invading the U.S. Capitol. And I I think one thing about this book, I'm hesitant to compare historical periods, but we do live in a period where the truth is fragile. In any case, among Strang's other accomplishments, he was elected twice to the Michigan State Legislature. And this is one of the places where he's really complex. Among the people who were listed as living on Beaver Island at that time and being eligible to vote was this man, Napoleon Bonaparte. Strang was a big fan of Bonaparte, and Strang's elections, both of them, were incredibly fraudulent. He knew how to game the system, and he also knew how to just plain cheat. But once he got to Lansing, to the legislature, he did stuff that was really interesting. So Strang was a lifetime opponent to slavery. He was an abolitionist. And I say in The King of Confidence, this was his sort of bottom line, that if there's any truth to Strang, it's that he was opposed to slavery. And I think my book advances, gives us an insight as to what his beliefs about this were. But when he got to the Michigan legislature, he supported a bill that undercut the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And this was called a personal liberty law. And these are really fascinating to see. And he was a leading proponent of this. He did this against his own best interest, which is what fascinated me, because I know of no other case in Strang's life where he did that. In his second term in the legislature was the first period where Republicans just sweep into power. As some of you know, the Republican Party is often said to have started in Michigan. And in Strang's second term, all of a sudden, this brand new party takes the governor's mansion and both parts of the state house. And Strang was a lifetime Democrat, but he worked with them to pass this personal liberty law that massively undercut the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed slave owners to bring slaves back from the North. At one point, he spoke on the floor of the legislature for 2 hours in support of freedom for slaves and in the rights of African Americans. He also published this guy in his newspaper. This is Frederick Douglass, a famous abolitionist, freed slave. And I was shocked when I was going back through Strang's newspaper on Beaver Island, which was, I talk about in the book, was read and parts of it were republished all over the country. So Strang was really a national figure. And we can talk about why that was. But I noticed this article by Fred Douglass. There was Fred Douglass. And I read it, and it's super interesting. And I said, was this published in other newspapers at the time? And it wasn't. It was an excerpt from an autobiography Douglass had just recently published, and Strang stuck it in there. But as with all things with Strang, it cut both ways. So this article was Douglass writing about why it's acceptable and when it's acceptable for slaves to steal from their masters, right? So, of course, on Beaver Island, that would have read differently than it might have read in other places where people are out actively stealing because they believe they're bringing around Christ's second coming and can't waste time with the petty laws of earthlings, right? And Strang was also progressive in other ways. He enforced a dress code on Beaver Island in which women were supposed to wear pantaloons, what look like pajama pants to us now. But in the mid-19th century, these were hugely controversial to people. So some women were wearing them on the island a year before Amelia Bloomer famously wore them as an act of proto-feminism, right? And we call them bloomers now, but they were actually being used on Beaver Island before that. But as with Strang, there's two sides to this, right? So I think he was progressive about women's rights to a certain extent for his time. But I think also these gave him control, right? So eventually he said, all women on the island will wear the bloomers or the pantaloons. And this became a huge controversy that led to Strang's death. There were many other factors involved, but people sort of dug in. Some of his followers forbade their wives, or the wives refused to wear the pantaloons, the people who were opposed to Strang. And the people who were for Strang wore the pantaloons. The women wore the pantaloons. If it sounds goofy, I'll just remind you about the way masks signify in our own culture, right? And clothes are always big signifiers. Anyway, this eventually led some of Strang's followers to plot against him, a plot that almost certainly involved the U.S. government and the state of Michigan. And so in 1856, he was living at this house in Beaver Island, and the USS Michigan, that ship I told you about earlier, showed up again. By that time, Strang was used to the ship making its rounds, and there was a friendly relationship between him and the captain. But this wasn't a scheduled stop, and so Strang knew, according to eyewitnesses, something was up from the start. He was eventually, so the captain of the ship sent a courier to come get Strang, and as Strang walked to the ship, he was gunned down and beaten by some of his own followers, and he was paralyzed from the waist down. Eventually, he was moved from Beaver Island and died in this house in Burlington, Wisconsin. Interestingly, I'll say that the people of Burlington, on Beaver Island, there's almost no physical evidence. There's very little physical evidence of Strang's kingdom, which was wiped out shortly after his death by angry fishermen and other local people. And now Beaver Island is known as the Emerald Island. The Irish fishermen sort of took it over. And there's very little evidence of Strang, but there's a real interest in the Strang story there. In Burlington, by contrast, this house still exists. Several of Strang's colonies' house still exists. There's not much interest. When I visited Burlington recently, there was a kid maybe in his 20s out cutting the grass. This is a picture from my visit from the house Strang was killed in. And I asked him if he lived there. He said, yeah, I'm renting this place. And I said, do you know anything about what happened here? He goes, oh, yeah, my boss told me some wild crap happened here. So he knew almost nothing about it. It's not that the people of Burlington know nothing. I think they're just less interested. But in Burlington, there's still some remnants of Strang's church. This is it's a small group of Strangites, as they call themselves, and there are some in other parts of the country as well. And I don't know much about the Strangite church, but there it is. That's me on a kayaking visit where we happen to stop in Burlington in front of the Strangite church. In any case, that's James Jesse Strang, and this is my book. On the left is the hardback, on the right back, other way, yeah, the left is the hardback, and on the right is the paperback, which was just out recently. And I'm honored to have been a guest with you, and I'm looking forward to talking to some of the members after a musical interlude, right? Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you again so much, Miles. That was super fascinating. I'll have to pick up the book. In just a moment, we'll be taking questions from our live chat on YouTube. But before the Q&A period, we'll have a short musical interlude where we'll encourage you to visit the link in the chat and make a donation. We suggest $5, but any amount you're able to give will help us continue host programs like today. So feel free to get those questions ready. And thank you so much for your support. All right. Well, thank you everybody who was able to contribute. In the meantime, we are going to start the Q&A portion where I will be getting the questions from our YouTube chat and I'll be able to read them so Miles can answer them for you. So let me get in position and we will have some questions coming up.
Thanks, Glenda.
All right, first question is going to be coming in a couple parts. The observations that the U.S. applauded charlatans who were smart and made a buck regardless of harm feels like an important expansion of rugged individualism. The king of confidence is thoroughly researched, including references to literature. All right, my apologies. I got first half of a question that we'll go back to. Apparently, it's coming in two parts, and the second part had come through. My apologies are to our YouTube audience. Let's start with the first question I have in full. The king of confidence is thoroughly researched, including references to literature of the mid-19th century. Can you share the research and process that went into writing this book?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it was well, I love research. So I guess I talk about three things there. The first is that one of the things I got lucky with Strang is, as with the mainstream Mormon church in Salt Lake City, the Mormons around Strang were great record keepers. And a lot of us know that Ancestry.com, it was started from Mormon records. There's for various reasons, there's a real interest in that sort of stuff. And I think also just in these really intense times, people thought they were bringing the second coming of Christ, and they thought Strang was a true prophet of God, and they saved stuff. So at the Beinecke Library in Yale, there's a huge collection of Strang's letters, of his journal.
Yeah, we want to apologize for that interruption. Sometimes computers decide that they have their own agendas, and we have let them know to get back on task. Yeah. So, Miles, if you're able to continue where you left off on your answer.
Yeah, I think I was just talking about how I had access to newspaper databases from the mid-19th century that just weren't available before. And so I was at 3 a.m. in my basement making discoveries that would have been impossible for researchers of, even 5 or 10 years ago. And so that was, I think I'm a good researcher, and I think I'm a dogged researcher, but that was something that was definitely to my advantage. One other part of the research, which was in the question, which it was just a joy. I'm an English professor, and so a writer. That's what I do for a living, and so I love books. But one of the things I indulged in was just reading massively. From the writers of the mid-19th century. Some people, I revisited and rediscovered Poe, Melville. The Confidence Man, Poe's his last novel published in his lifetime, which is one of the most amazing books I've ever read, really influenced sort of my thinking about this. But also people like Margaret Fuller, the proto-feminist, people I hadn't read before. And so I wanted to immerse myself in this world. I mean, I think a lot of these writers were writing about these strange times in different ways. There's con men figures in Hawthorne's books, certainly in Twain's books, and I just, this whole idea of a sort of a truth, all that is solid melts into air, as Marx put it in the Communist Manifesto, where the world just seemed to be in flux to a great degree.
All right, I have gotten the complete question that I originally tried to start with. So let's get back to that one. The observation that U.S. applauded charlatans who were smart and made a buck regardless of harm feels like an important expansion of rugged individualism, quote unquote, and maybe why labeling anything, quote unquote, socialist is a winning strategy still. Any thoughts on how and why that persists 150 years later and how to ameliorate it?
Yeah, I mean, so sort of two. That's a great question in two parts. Strang, this rugged individualism. Strang lived in the high era of the self-made man. That was a phrase that was incredibly common in the mid 19th century, and in some ways he lived it. I mean, I often compare Strang to Abraham Lincoln. Both were these farm boys. I mean, that's what Strang was, and that's what Lincoln was. These obscure farm boys who educated themselves, became lawyers, and they became lawyers the old-fashioned way by studying with another lawyer, not by going to law school. So they became these country lawyers. Both of them worked as postmasters. Both of them were elected to the General Assembly in their state. And, and they both had the ability to inspire people. Strang could have used his ability to inspire for good. And I'm not sure what stopped him. Partly one of the great things about writing about him, he's so three-dimensional. He was really an intellectually curious person, like Lincoln was. But I think a kind of narcissism. I mean, I don't want to psychoanalyze the guy, because what I love about him is his dimensionality and his contradictions. But Lincoln went on to really use his powers for greatness, and Strang got shot by his own people. And so that's the strategy. As far as our own times, I do think there's some comparison, and I think that, for instance, I think QAnon is a lot like the appeal of QAnon is a lot like the appeal of Strang, right? That there are simple answers to complex questions, that a certain group of people are the chosen people, the people in the know, and everyone else is not in the know, including anything that's in the mainstream press. And so, some people have read The King of Confidence, and I think rightfully so, or I'm happy with it as a allegory for our own times. But I guess I should point out that I only make reference to our own times twice in oblique ways in the book, once in the beginning and once in the very last line of the book. But I don't mention President Trump. I don't mention anything. I wanted, partly because I wanted the book to withstand the test of time. I don't see it as a simple allegory for our times. And also because I trust readers to make their own links and connect the dots in their own way. And I think the Strang story stands up by itself, and it's not just an allegory for our own times. But I will say that I started writing the book right around about the time Trump announced his candidacy for president. And so one of the joys of this book, or benefits of this book, was Trump gave me a way of understanding Strang, and Strang also gave me a way of understanding Trump. And that was useful through a difficult time, and when we're still in that difficult time in American history.
You mentioned he was nationally known. Can you say more about how he gained wider notoriety?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the things that I advance in my book. So Strang was brilliant at using media. So there was this thing called exchange papers in the mid-19th century. There's a newspaper boom. Newspapers are all over the country, even in the most far away parts of the wilderness. And these newspapers are communicating with each other all the time. What the postal law allowed newspapers to send copies of the paper to each other for free. And so, newspapers were getting hundreds of other newspapers all the time. And what they would do is they would take stories out of those newspapers, and sometimes they would credit the other papers, but often they just cut it or typeset it and use it as their own story. People at the time, and this is where the telegraph is going on, so news is flying really fast. People at the time realized, wow, the editor of a New York paper said, this is like, we can get our news out to the provinces in amazing time. Well, Strang's genius was, I can get my news into it can work the other way. I can get my news from the provinces all over the world. So he was a good writer. He was had his own newspapers in both of his colonies. He was very consistent about publishing those papers, and he understood human interest. He understood what stories would gain traction. And so Strang's stories, often from newspapers that Strang ran, were published widely. And, Strang's death was front page of the New York Times. It was covered all over the world. And again, that's not because people had correspondence on Beaver Island. It's because people were using stories from Midwestern papers and using them in print. So this is a little bit like a early version of the internet. It's not exactly, I say in the book, it's not exactly an information superhighway, but it's like a information, muddy road that stuff is moving really fast on. And so that's a big part of it. Yeah.
This next question, I'm going to try to paraphrase a little bit because it was kind of said as a statement. They're asking if there's any suggestions for any kind of like mental or, thoughtful defense against the likes of Strang. And they're thinking of more about our entire system of advertising, mainstream media, coordinated disinformation, and kind of anti-STEM thinking as well.
Well, yeah, I don't begrudge. I mean, I'll just talk about, I don't begrudge STEM, which I think is important. It's important to be technologically advanced. As a professor at what purports to be a liberal arts university, I will say I think the liberal arts are under fire, and I think the liberal arts offer us a way of as the best way, as in Strang's time, allowing people to read widely, think critically. There's a bunch of surveys now in recent times that show that employers actually embrace people with liberal arts. But I think there's a general lack of, there's an illiberalism on both left and right in our country now, where we are not embracing those core values of discussion, debate, honoring other people's ideas. We spend a lot of time trying to shut each other up these days. And I lament that. As far as the rest of the question goes, I mean, I guess I would also say that in times like ours, when I think we're not always, and this has to do with STEM, as aware of how technology allows people like Strang. So Strang was, and he wasn't writing theses on, the new information technology in the mid-19th century. He just intuitively understood it. And I think we see, since I wrote the book, I've sort of become more and more aware of people who are these con men who are a little bit ahead of technology. There's a book called, what's it called? Anyway, there's this guy, Dr. Brinkley. I'm going to just use the word goat gonad here, the famous goat gonad doctor from the Depression era, who convinced tens of thousands of American men that they needed goat gonads. It was kind of the brutal, ugly version of the little blue pill at the time, inserted in their own scrotums. And it was a total fraud, and many people died from it. But the guy who practiced it is considered one of the early pioneers of radio. Dr. Brinkley, the guy who did it, had his own radio station, huge station in Kansas that he broadcast out to the rest of the country. And when he was kicked out of the United States, he just put up a pirate station on the Mexican border. And so he was able to draw people. And I think in our own time, we see how people who can use Twitter take advantage of it. But in terms of combating this sort of thinking, I just think, to a certain extent, it's what happens in times of technological flux and social economic upheaval. But I do think the hope is that I think liberal democracies have done a good job of bringing people into discussion, into conversation, giving us a sense that we are part of a bigger patchwork. And so right now we're struggling over how big that patchwork should be. And I think the quilt can be big and it's greater for its bigness. That's what I think.
How much do you think the James Strang story is a unique American story, and how much of it is specific to the mid-19th century?
Well, I think we see in our own time that the truth is porous and that certain people will take advantage of it. Yeah, and as far as, I mean, con men exists everywhere. I mean, I'm obviously speaking at a time when, you know, Vladimir Putin is very much in the news. You know, Russian propaganda is really interesting right now, because it used to be that there was one story, right? And if you didn't go with the one story, you got sent to Siberia. There was only one truth. Putin's whole thing, and it's something that people on the United States have picked up on, is the multiple truth idea. There's like, yeah, it might be that, or it might be that, or, you know, this might be true too. Or, you know, President Trump was always like, you know, even with Putin, he said, well, that's what Putin says. He said, well, I'm not going to say if it's true or not. And I think this is a problem of the left and the right. I think there's where we get too much into my truth and not enough into the truth. And the truth becomes kind of a passé idea. And I'm not saying there is an absolute truth, but I think there's certain things we can pin down. Scientists may be wrong in some respects about climate change, but that doesn't change the truth of the broader truth of climate change, for instance. Yeah.
Who lives on Beaver Island now? Is there anything remaining there to mark or memorialize James Strang there?
Oh, that's a great question. So there's a lot of place names, including the only real town on Beaver Island, which is St. James. There's also the one long paved road on Beaver Island is called the King's Highway. It's something that Strang, he obviously didn't have pavement then, but he put, I think, what was called a corduroy road, where they put logs side by side. But anyway, he had his people build a big road through the forest. And there's a lot of different place names, biblical place names that Strang. But there's not much in terms of buildings. There's the old print shop. I spoke there this summer. That's now a museum. And Beaver Island's an incredibly beautiful place. I wouldn't want to be there in winter, but a lot of people aren't there in winter. But it still feels very much like the frontier. There's a lot of rich people who live there and have these gorgeous places on great water. But still, most of the island is dirt roads. You know, my family and I went up there when I was researching this book, and we're just struck by, you know, how much of the island is just unpaved. And even some of the roads are really hard to identify as roads. It's really cold and iced in the winter. And so it's a very, very beautiful place. And in some ways, there's a certain amount of wealth there now. So in some cases, really considerable wealth. You know, there's some really nice, some people, it's their vacation place and they have these big homes. But it also feels really removed. You know, when I was up there the first time, my family and I stayed on the south end of the island. The island, I'm thinking, is about maybe 3-4 miles wide and maybe 15 miles long. We stayed near the south end of the island, and my teenage children were absolutely aghast that not only did we not have internet, but our cell phones could not get signals. So you can feel really, really removed from society still, which I think is what Strang wants. You know, wanted. In Burlington, where he had his first utopian colony, he had attracted people from the church, including one of Joseph Smith's brothers, but people quickly soured on him. And his problem in Burlington was his enemies stayed and a lot of his followers left. It was just there's too much give and take there. We know this was when cults, we didn't have the word cult then, but it was when there was sort of first widespread identification of this phenomenon. And we know from cults, one of the things is isolation. So I think Strang realized, if I get these people up to this island, I can control things much, much better. So there's not a ton of evidence, but as I said, there's a really strong memory of Strang. They're really interested in Strang on Beaver Island, and a lot of discussion of Strang, whereas in Burlington, not so much.
Can you tell us more about the scale of polygamy on Beaver Island? The person asking the question referenced how it was used in Utah as a way of recruitment for the Mormon church. And I guess they're wondering if there's any parallels there.
Well, polygamy was the big secret in the mainstream Mormon church for many years. And so Strang was a really interesting figure. I mentioned this sort of briefly in my talk. When Smith died, there were there were several people who were claiming to be his natural heir to the church. Strang was in some ways the least likely of them, but he was smart about bolstering his candidacy, as opposed to Brigham Young, who was his sort of great rival. Young originally claimed, like, I'm just a really good bureaucrat, I can take over the church. And Strang said, I'm a prophet. God chose me. Young later tweaked his story a little bit. But the other thing about Strang was he claimed that he was completely against polygamy. He said something like, I will never, ever believe in polygamy, blah, blah, blah. Like many things Strang said, that didn't last long. I don't really know his own views on polygamy or how much faith came into it. But he eventually took on polygamy. This became a problem on Beaver Island. As in Nauvoo, polygamy was limited to a fairly small number of church leaders. And it created a kind of disconnect. A lot of Strang's followers on Beaver Island had specifically come to Beaver Island because they were fed up with polygamy in Nauvoo. And so the introduction of polygamy kind of openly on Beaver Island did not make them happy. And so I talked about this Pantaloon rebellion, they sometimes call it, on Beaver Island. I mean, I think that polygamy was underpinning that. Arguments over polygamy were underpinning that. So I'm not sure how much it benefited Strang. As far as polygamy and faith goes, I can't say. I mean, I think some people in the mainstream Mormon church believed it was actually part of their faith, and I don't know what Strang believed. He certainly, like other church leaders, quoted Old Testament or cited Old Testament, saying, that the prophets of old had multiple wives. But I don't really know what his belief on it was. And as always, I'm not sure he was able to separate the idealism from the opportunism always.
What do you know about Strang's descendants? Did you interview any of them for your book?
No, I've heard from some of them since, and I don't know much. He had many descendants because of his polygamous practices. So there's as with all genealogy, I think it's a little tricky. I think I just know in my family, we have the stories that we're told. And then, when we get those of us who have done genetic testing through Ancestry or other sites, we learn that some of the things we assumed about our family, we have Native American heritage, turns out either to be more true than we ever thought or not at all true. And so I don't really know much. I mean, I've been in touch with some of Strang's descendants. My own interest in getting more documents and or photographs has not happened yet. But I don't know. I really can't say if any of them are still involved in the Strangite Church. I'm not sure any of the ones I've talked to, but there are, as I said, the church exists, and I've definitely in touch with members, and grateful to a couple of them for not only for in one case, their met with me in Burlington, and it was great discussing stuff with them. And in other cases, just some people who've, authored or edited books that were important to my research. And I'm grateful to them for their good work.
Did Strang's promotion of Mormonism contribute to its growth and continued popularity?
I don't think, I mean, people say, one of the fun things about the publicity around this book was I went on some Mormon podcasts and was struck by talking to my hosts how little is known about Strang in the church in Salt Lake City, in the mainstream branch of the Mormon church. Strang was kicked out of the church really early on. He never went back to Nauvoo to proselytize. He as usual used media to get stuff. He would write these open letters to people living in Nauvoo. This was right when the Mormons were getting kicked out of Nauvoo and heading west, and people were scared, and they had good reason to be scared. Brigham Young was leading them into literally a territory that had only recently been mapped, and the maps turned out to have been wrong. And Strang basically said, do you really want to endanger yourselves in that way? Going west into an unknown world that's currently inhabited by Native Americans who may not welcome you is probably not a wise move. Why don't you just come up and hang out with me in Burlington? And I think a lot of people took him up on that. So what was the original question?
Did his promotion of Mormonism
Yeah.
to...
So I don't think, I mean, he was, a well-known man at the time, but it was not like he really threatened the Mormon church so much, although really interestingly, and this is another thing that sort of, I dug out more fully than anyone has before in my book. In 1853, when the Democrats came into power in the White House, there was some talk of making Strang the governor of Utah. And Strang actually started for Washington hoping to lobby for that position. That would have been a mess with Strang overseeing the church in Utah. It never did happen, but Mormon officials in Washington, D.C. took it very seriously and wrote to Brigham Young about it. Said, you better watch out, basically Strang's a real threat. He never, as far as I know, even made it to Washington. He had a not happy return to his hometown in Western New York, and he may have gone straight back to Beaver Island from there. I never found any evidence that he made it to D.C. But he was a serious threat to Brigham Young in certain ways. But the numbers weren't there. That there was tens of thousands of Mormons in Utah, and Strang inflated the numbers on Beaver Island, but they were probably in the upper hundreds or mid hundreds or thousands by the time he was kicked off. So it was a significant number of people, and they caused a lot of craziness in the Midwest. But I don't think he brought a lot of new members into the mainstream church. That would be my guess. I'm not a church historian, so we should caution anything I say about that. That I'm not a church historian.
I think you kind of touched upon this, but this next question is: any idea why Strang is mostly forgotten?
Oh yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think what I say in the book is he's taken on sort of this mythic quality, like Paul Bunyan or Johnny Appleseed kind of quality. Oh, did you there's a guy who had a quasi-independent nation on Beaver Island for a short time, and the government tried to, you hear these stories, and I think the difference between my book and the ones that came before is, and I got to say, at least 3 of those books are quite good. There's one by a recent one by a woman named Vicki Cleverly Speak, that focuses on women in Strang's church. That's great, and I learned a lot from those books. But those books tend to treat Strang as a footnote in Mormon history or a footnote in Midwestern history. There's a book called Assassination of a Michigan King on University of Michigan Press. Again, quite a good book. But I saw Strang as a lightning rod for all the excesses and craziness of mid-19th century America. I saw this as not a Midwestern story or a Mormon story, but uniquely and powerfully American story. And so that's where I think The King of Confidence is a little bit different than some of the other books about Strang.
What do you think Strang thought success looked like?
What a great question. I think Strang thought success looked like power. And I think he was less interested in money. I think Strang would have, again, there's this Lincoln comparison that I'm haunted by. Strang was such an interesting figure because when he was elected to the Michigan legislature completely fraudulently. But once he got there, even his worst enemies said, this guy's a really good speaker and he understands how legislation works and he's easy to work with and he's a serious guy. And so you've got this, again, you've got the opportunist and idealist. The opportunist gets him to Lansing, to the State House. The idealist and the very competent writer, and he's obviously got legal background, makes him, even by his own worst enemy's estimation, quite a good lawmaker. And so, I just, could he have done more good for the world? Maybe. I'm not sure he knew, what he wanted. I do think he may have been like a little bit like I imagine President Trump to be, that he both knew that he was lying to people and conning people, but he thought, I'm sort of better than these other people. I'm the chosen one. Only I can fix it, kind of thing. And what's a little theft, right? What's a little, we can fudge that, And yeah, this might not be real in terms of religion, but there's something I have over these people that makes me the chosen one. So as far as what he wanted, I don't know. I think he would have gladly been governor of Utah, for instance, which would have been a huge job and would have led to even more violence than was going on in that territory at the time.
I think I'll make this last question
Great.
because we're about ready to wrap it up. But you mentioned there were diaries from Strang's youth. Are there none from his later life that might reflect on his quote unquote true thoughts?
No, there are. What's interesting, and I quote them in the book, there are all sorts of letters. I was really interested in letters to his brother. Strang had a brother who was just a farmer in Western New York. He had lived the life. There's sort of great, I didn't write about this in the book, there's sort of great doppelgangers. His brother had lived the life that Strang was sort of destined to live if he hadn't reinvented himself a bunch of times. And his brother was, seemingly kind of a normal guy. Obviously we could argue about what that means, but, at times he would just write back to Strang and say, you're really troubled, that's crazy. But Strang would write him with these grandiose things. He seemed to trust his brother, but he would also, talk about his fears a little bit, or talk about, for instance, he would talk about how ill-treated he'd been in his hometown and how he wanted to basically make this glorious return, which turned out to not be glorious at all. Strang got in all sorts of trouble in his hometown and was sort of mocked. And so no, there's no sort of like the coded part of the journals are so amazing. What I will say about, and there's nothing like that in his later letters, or nothing quite like that in his later letters. What I will say about those coded parts, Strang was an incredible self-actualizer. Almost everything there's craziness in there. Like he says in his coded parts, if I only had the chance, I would marry Princess Victoria, later Queen Victoria, and become King of England. And it's insane, like this farm boy in Western New York. But really, when he says, he says at one point, I have dreams of royalty and power. And he achieves almost all of his dreams. At some point, he lists it. He was Talks about being a lawyer, he became that. Talks about it being a leader of human beings, he became that. Talks about being a priest, he became, or a religious person, he became that. This person with crazy, wild ambitions was, if nothing else, an amazing self-actualizer.
Thank you so much, Miles Harvey, for this great talk. And
Oh,
I know
thank
there's
you.
going to be a few of us that are going to be ready to read that book afterwards, but we are now going to segue to announcements.
Great. Thank you. Oh, I should get out of here.
All right. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I wanted to get a quick quote in about persuasion. Persuasion is often more effectual than force, and that's from Aesop. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this Sunday. We hope to see you at the next one, and enjoy the rest of your day.